All right. So humans, just like all kinds of animal species, acquire generic knowledge by accumulating their experiences with various kinds of entities that share properties or belong to the same class, just collecting information about them and gradually accumulating information about them. But humans learn much of their knowledge, one would say even most of their knowledge, from each other by social learning, not just by individual learning. Social learning is also widespread among many species. It can be based on pure observational learning. They observe each other, how they behave, what they do. It could be done by activities from the source of the knowledge. In terms of teaching, in some species, it's primarily scaffolding, changing the environment of the learner in order to that facilitate with the learning. And also teaching by communication, which I think is specific to humans. Also, many species communicate about various kinds of things, mainly about the here and now. But only humans are the ones who pass their knowledge to each other by communication. So this is a very simplistic way how to organize the kinds of classifications that I mentioned here by source and content. A source could be observation or communication, so activity from the source as well. And the content could be local information, which is relevant here and now, or something which is generalizable to knowledge. So observation, learning of local information is like witnessing something. This is when, for example, pigeons see that other pigeons are gathering at a certain location. It's information for them that probably there are food there, food source. It could be local information by sharing, by communication. Alarm calls or the bee dance are good examples of that in other species. One could also observe how other animals behave and what benefits they get from their actions, but that's learned by some kind of imitation. But when this kind of generalizable knowledge is passed to others by communication, that's what we call pedagogy, and I think it is specific to humans. Now, the idea behind the whole talk here is that human communication is adapted to the specific need for knowledge transmission to others. And of course, most of this transmission is performed by language, and the generic expressions are the best way to do this. Generic expressions like koalas sleep 20 hours a day. This is just magic, just humans can do that. I share this information, you acquire this generic knowledge, even if you haven't seen a koala before, not to mention that you haven't observed them sleeping and haven't collected the average amount of sleep that it is. It's amazing that humans can do with these kind of sentences. And it's interesting that these kinds of generic expressions are come in various syntactic forms. Practically, there is no single syntactic form that would be specific to generics in any languages, as far as I know. So there are plurals. One example in English, there's the koalas, or indefinite singulars. An Englishman never lies. Definite singulars. The radio was invented in Italy, and so on. There are many different forms of that. It has also been suggested that generic interpretation of linguistic assertions is the default interpretation. So you have to actually add various kinds of quantifiers or determiners in order to restrict the validity of the predicates to something else than a generic interpretation. And this is shown by various kinds of memory biases, mainly that if people can confuse for example, universally quantified utterances with generic expressions, and the bias goes towards genericity. Now, the main beneficiaries of knowledge transmission are children, because they are the most need of acquiring the knowledge that accumulated in their society. And they also saw evidence of this kind of default generics. For example, language acquisition. We know that the children very early on understand generic expressions, understand them properly, much earlier than they understand quantifiers properly. But the hypothesis that we are entertaining here is that the transmission of generic knowledge is not rooted in linguistics, but it's a basic function of human communication, irrespective of the medium, how it is delivered, and therefore nonverbal communication is also adapted for this purpose, which is especially important for preverbal infants and young children who are not competent language users. So what kind of information you can transmit by nonverbal communication? You can transmit instrumental actions, know-how, how to do things. You can transmit information about properties and functions of objects, and also social rules and rituals, among others. There are other kinds of things as well, but these are the most important ones. So what are the cognitive prerequisites for being able to get this information from adults who share their knowledge to infants? So in order to benefit from them, first they have to be able to realize that they are being communicated to, because that would be the channel of the knowledge in which it's coming. They have to be able to identify the medium of the communication, so extracting local reference there. They have to be able to infer generic knowledge from the information that displayed by adults. That is, that we have to be able to extend the information beyond the actual situation. And so, more recently, we are working on ideas about how symbolic displays created by objects are actually adopted for this purpose. The prototypical pedagogical display is an action demonstration, so I'm going to show you examples later on. But before that, I'm going to go through some evidence that we and others collected among these lines. So I'm going to talk about first the infant sensitivity to communicative signals, then how they extract local reference, and then how they how to extend information beyond the actual situation. And I may mention some ideas about these symbolic displays, what role they play in this knowledge transmission. So starting from the first, even newborns are sensitive to signals that may indicate to them that they are being addressed by communicators. I list here 4 different kinds of signals that we know that infants are sensitive to. One of them is eye contact, which would indicate that whoever is making eye contact is communicating to them. Infra-directed speech, which is more specific to infants, some kind of intonation that suggests that whatever someone is talking about something, and it gets the information of the specific intonation that you use with infants that suggests to them that they are being addressed by this speech. Contingent reactivity. Someone is contingently react to whatever they do. That could also be an indication that they are being addressed. And of course, your own name. Most of the times that you hear your own name, it's not used as referring to you, but as a vocative, practically addressing to you. So we know that these stimuli are discriminated from similar stimuli in newborns, not their own name, but their own name is the first one that they can extract from a noisy acoustic environment at about 4.5 months of age. They don't just discriminate these kinds of stimuli, they also prefer to them, that they can choose between them, that they look at eye contact, they turn towards the infradirected speech, they elicit contingent reactivity if they can, and also they like to hear their own name. This is also shown by how they react to these signals. It's mainly smiling, which it expresses their delight of being addressed, but also it's also a feedback signal to the communicator that just continue what you are doing. I like that. Right? And there are many examples of that in the literature. I'm not going to go through them. Instead of I'm going to show you just one example of this with eye contact. So if you show newborn babies these two images, life size, about 30 centimeters from their face, next to each other, then they tend to look longer to the face with direct gaze, tend to look more times to the face with direct gaze, and this applies to practically almost all the infants, so it's a very quiet, strong effect. This can be also shown by just showing them schematic faces. They don't have to be real faces, which suggests that what kind of template they might have about a communicative face to them. There's also evidence that this is not based on simply a preference for symmetry, because if you turn the faces upside down, they don't show the effect. Also, they don't prefer to see direct gaze stimuli when the heads are turned away, at least not at newborns, but by 4 months of age they already learned this, and it was again the same effect, that they prefer to look at the direct gaze even if the head is turned away. So infants are sensitive to this information if somebody is looking at them, but it's not just that. So gaze also important, not just for figuring out that someone is making eye contact with me and them, but also about figuring out the gaze directions of others, which is interestingly assisted by human anatomy. Human eyes are different from other primates in the sense that they are wider horizontally, they expose higher proportion of the sclera, and the sclera is white, and so it creates a high contrast with the iris. And so this is human specific, and we know that because Hollywood cartoonists actually use these features to actually anthropomorphize animals. These animals usually don't have this large white sclera, at least not visible, but in real life. But on the cartoons, yes, this is how you anthropomorphize them, and it's also not restricted to Hollywood artists. I was just in Japan 2 weeks ago, and you have these drawings there 400 years ago with the tigers, which is a very large white sclera. So it's actually well known everywhere. And so that what this high contrast and this anatomy is doing is not just allowing you to figure out that someone is looking at you or not, but actually figuring out where someone is looking at. So you know, for example, that you can figure out that these two dogs are looking at each other, right? If you don't have those white sclera, it's actually not quite clear when two dogs are looking at each other, but here this is. And also, humans are very sensitive to this kind of contrast differences, including babies. And this is shown, for example, by this Bogart effect. If you see the illusion, that you probably, your first impression is that Humphrey Bogart is looking to the left on the polarity inverted version. So, what do we use these kinds of information? We can figure out where someone else is looking, and this is evidence that infants do that as well, is the so-called gaze following phenomenon, which they start to do from about 5 months of age expressively. There are earlier effects that suggest that they are sensitive to gaze directions as well, but not in explicit behavior. Now, it's not just humans again that follow others' gaze. Many other species do that, but they don't interpret looking as a potential communicative signal. Just one piece of evidence of that is the so-called object choice task, which is done with many kinds of primates to figure out which of two containers contain some food for them. So if you touch one of the containers, or you point close by one of the containers, or you approach one of the containers, they would choose the container. They think that would be a good signal that someone is, that probably includes some kind of food. But if you just look at one of the containers, either by head turn or just by gaze direction, they would not be able to get this signal that would be the location where something is. Now, if you study gaze following in very young infants, in the case 6-month-old infants, it turns out that they're more likely to follow gaze in communicative context than in non-communicative context, suggesting that they interpret these gaze directions communicatively. So here is some evidence of that. You see a person looking at left or right, one of two objects, but before that she made an eye contact with the viewer. What you see there, the blue dots, is the actual gaze pattern of a single infant in a single trial. And in this case, they tend to follow the gaze. So the first look from the head to the object would go to the object that the person was looking at before. But if there's no eye contact with them, but infant's direction is, if its attention is drawn to the head by this other kind of stimuli, then at least at this age, they hardly follow the gaze. And eye contact is not the only communicative signal. As I mentioned, there are other communicative signals that infants are sensitive to. If you precede head turning by infant-directed speech, then they're likely to follow the gaze. If it is preceded by
hello,
the same word by an adult-directed intonation, then they're less likely to follow the gaze. It suggests that they interpret these gaze cues as a potential communicative cues. What are they communicating? They are communicating about potential reference in the environment. So the question is whether infants really expect to find something there when they follow the gaze. In this case, they didn't have to expect because there was something there. You can study this by showing them situations where they don't see what's there, where someone is looking at, for example, this way.
Wow.
And then you reveal an object at that location. Or at the other location, and then we just measure whether infants, what they look at in this kind of situation, especially how much they look at the empty side in the situation. We know that infants don't like to look at nothing, so they actually, in most of these cases, they look at the objects there, but you can still measure how much they look at the empty space here. And it turns out that both 8 and 12-month-olds look longer and switch more times towards the empty side when the object should have been there on the basis of the gaze pattern of the person before that. The same kind of results can also be shown not just by looking, communicative looking, but another gesture, pointing, which is definitely used as a deictic signal in human communication. Now, you could say that even if infants follow the gaze and then they expect to find something there, it doesn't necessarily. It's not evidence that they interpret that object as a referent of the communication of the person. So we could try to test it in a different way using two different communicative signals, one Deictic signals and labels. So in the first study here, we used object labels that we know that 12-month-olds, average 12-month-olds would understand. In this case, average English 12-month-olds. So it looked like this.
Baby? It's a duck! Look! A duck! Wow! A duck!
And it is a duck.
Hey, baby! It's a spoon! Look! A spoon! Wow! A spoon!
Oh, it's not a spoon. So what happens here is that in this case infants look longer, somehow expressing that this is not what they expected to find there. Now, it's clear here is that if infants just expect to find something there where someone is pointing, then they should be satisfied in both cases equally. If infants just expect to find a spoon or a duck whenever they hear spoon and duck, they would be satisfied in both cases. So the only way to figure out that there is something wrong here is they think that these two signals should refer to the very same object. Another way to test this is with the same age infants with novel objects, completely novel objects, and using novel labels to them. So this is how it went. This will be in Hungarian, but very simple.
Egy pádu. Hű, egy pádu. Egy pádu.
A pádu. This is what she says. And then the objects are occluded, and then disoccluded, and then change locations as well.
Nézd csak! Hol van a pádu?
And we ask them, look, where is the pádu? Right?
Pádu.
And then we measure which object they are looking at. So the contrast here is that whether you use the same label as before or a different label, and it turns out that with the same label they look at the objects which was originally labeled, and with the new label they don't look. They actually look at the other objects, which is interesting in itself, but it's not the topic of this talk. So the point here is not that infants can interpret labels. That's good news, but they interpret the labels in a way that would show you that they interpret the pointing as a referential signal. Otherwise, they would not be able to match the labels with the objects or learn the labels for the objects. So, at least by 12 months of age, probably earlier, infants figure out what someone is talking about, and they interpret them as a referent, but how they encode them. So in the study, we showed infants and objects in two different contexts. This is one of them. This is an object-directed action, but not a communicative action.
Hello, baby.
But this is one. This is communicative actions.
How?
She talks infant-directed speech. She looks at the viewer, and then she points. It's definitely a communicative gesture. So the question is whether this difference has an effect on what they encode about the object in this situation. So then we occlude the person and the object, and then we reveal the object in three different ways. Either there is no change, or the location changed, or the object changed to a different object. And then we just measure looking time to figure out which features infants encoded, whether they encoded the location or how the object looks like. And it turns out that in the reaching case, infants mainly encoded the location, where the object was before, which is not surprising because that's what they expected, that the reaching will actually complete the reaching to a particular location to grasp an object. But in the pointing case, they actually to my surprise, actually, they forgot completely about the location of the object in this particular case, but they remembered how the object looked like, so they detected when we changed the object. And why is this the case? One potential explanation is that because object features are relevant for generalization. Whatever someone communicates about that object could be actually generalized to objects of the same kind, and object features are probably relevant to figure out what objects are the same kind. And similar findings were also reported by other groups as well recently. So, what's the evidence that actually infants learn? They don't just find the objects, they don't just encode what they are, but they learn something about the object in communication, which they would not learn otherwise. Here is a study that might show that. So, in the study, infants are faced with a person. It's a live study, faced with a person who is not communicating them initially, and there are two objects on the table. Sorry. And then this person looks at one of the objects in a positive way, expressing a positive attitude, delight about this object. And then the other objects with a negative attitude, it's disgust. And then she turns to the infant. The two objects are pushed in front of the infants, and then asks the infants to give her an object. And there's a question which object infants would give her. And in this case, they give her the object that she liked. So, they actually learned something about the person in this situation. And the fact that they learned something about the person, suggested by the fact that if you, after the initial expressions, you replace the person with another person, and she requests an object, then they tend to give her either the other objects or more likely to be randomly one of the objects. So what they learn here is actually some kind of personal preference of the person, which is not extendable to the other people. But the situation is completely different when you start the whole thing with a communicative context. In this case, they don't just observe someone expressing positive or negative attitudes about the objects, but they observe someone communicating to them about their attitudes towards one of the other objects. In this case, even if you bring a different person there to request the objects, they tend to give her the same objects. So in this case, they did not learn about the personal preference of the objects, but they interpreted the expressions as expressing something about the objects themselves. They interpreted them as object-directed evaluative attitudes as the property of the object. This object is good, or this object is bad. It's not just the personal preferences. So this is how communication changes the interpretation of very similar expressions. But again, this is just about a single object. They learn something about the object, about a single object, but in order to get generic knowledge or generalizable knowledge, they have to be able to extend this to some kind of category. So in that sense, communication actually should promote categorization in infants. We know that that's the case in linguistic communication. So it's, Sandra Waxman has been working on for 30 years or more to show that labeling, for example, promotes categorization even in very young infants as well. The question is whether it depends on labeling or not. So here's a study that would show that communication, non-verbal communication, could also promote categorization in infants. So in the study, first we train the object with a completely arbitrary association. Cups go to the right. Plates go to the left, right? And we show many of these examples to infants, and we know that they start to learn it after a while, because after a while, when the person lifts these objects and they hear the sound, and they start to anticipate the look right or left depending on what the object is. So they learn the association that which object goes to which side. After they learn this, we show them an additional demonstration, which goes like this.
Szia, baba, szia! Figyelj!
Hi, baby, hi, look.
Aha!
So what she shows here is shows an object which looks initially like a plate, but she opens it and it turns out that it's a cup. It's a collapsible cup, actually. And so we show them this demonstration either in a communicative way, like you said before, or this way.
Na lássuk, mi is lesz ebből.
She's not looking at the baby, she says, let's see what's this.
Aha.
And but actually shows the same transformation of the object. And the third group, actually, we skip this demonstration completely. And then we show them two more training sessions, two more training trials, just to remind them what's the rule here. In this case, the object doesn't go either right or left, so they don't know which way it would go. And then the test is that we show them this object. They hear the sound that would indicate that an animal would pop up on the right or left, and the question is which way they look at, right? And so we measure it, just they're looking, practically anticipation, on which side the animal should pop up from behind your clue there. The side which is the cup side, or the side which is the plate side. So if there is no demonstration, then they look at the plate side. Not surprising, this is what they learned. It looks like a plate, it should go to the plate side. If they receive the non-communicative demonstration, they are completely undecided. So they learn something about that object, because they know that it could be either a plate or a cup. But if it was presented to them in a communicative context, then they actually think that it's a cup. They look towards the cup side. Even if it looks like a plate, they look to the cup side, probably because they interpreted that this is what the demonstration showed me, that this looks like a plate, but it's a cup. So 1-year-old categorize objects on the basis of communicative demonstrations. But this is just categorization. I mean, it's again not like extension to other objects. So the best study that showed that young children can actually generalize their acquired knowledge, and they generalize it differently when this knowledge is communicated to them, was performed by Luke Butler many years ago. And the study goes like this. The experimenter takes an object, it's a liquid, and he demonstrates something about this object in 3 different ways. In the so-called pedagogical demonstration, he says, look, watch this. And then carefully lowers the objects on these paper clips, lifts it up, and it brings them with some paper clips because it's a magnetic object. In the so-called intentional condition, he doesn't introduce this action with this look, watch, this expression, but just takes the object, carefully lowers on of the paper clips, lifts it up, and says, wow. And third condition, he apparently accidentally drops the object into these paper clips. It says, oops, and again, in all 3 cases, children have information that this object is potentially magnetic because it lifts up the paper clips in all 3 cases. And then the experimenter takes the objects with himself, leaves the room and says, here are some more briquet, you can play with them. And then the trick of this study is that none of the other objects are magnetic. So the question is what children do in this case. So the measure is how many times they try to make this object work, or one of the objects works in the paper clips. And as you can see, 2- and 3-year-olds and even 4-year-olds in another study take many more attempts with these objects in the communicative condition than in the other two conditions, suggesting that they are more certain that these objects should be magnetic in that case than in other cases. So children generalize object properties to further exemplars if those properties were demonstrated to them in a communicative manner. But it's not quite clear from this that they do so because think that communication license is a stronger induction. They are more certain, simply just that this should be extended to the other briquets, this property, or because what they demonstrated to them would convey them generic knowledge directly. That they interpreted practically this action as if the experimenter said them, briquets are magnetic. Right? So whether the first or the second answer is the right answer could be investigated by how children react to counterevidence. So this is what we did in this study. In some sense, it's very similar, except that we measured generalization step by step, sequentially, and then so we can measure how children, now in this case actually infants because are 18-month-olds, how they are reacting to counterevidence. So we showed them this object, which is a very simple Lego brick, which if you push the top of them, they light up. At least the demo objects did that. It's demonstrated to infants that it lights up, and then infants can try themselves, and it works for them as well. And then we show them a counterexample, which is an object which looks exactly the same, but it's the battery is taken away from it, so it doesn't work. And then we show them a test object to see whether they learn something from the negative experience with the counterexample. And so the crucial contrast here is whether the original demonstration were delivered to them in a communicative or non-communicative manner. So if it is delivered in a non-communicative manner, what they do is what a rational learner should do. So they try the demo objects, they like it, and then counterexample, they even increase some of it because they are certain that it should work, but it gives them negative experience. And so then we give them the third object, they drop their confidence that this generalization could work, and so they try less times. But if originally the demonstration delivered them in a communicative manner, look and then show you that it lights up, then practically they don't learn from the counterexample. They keep up testing the test objects as many times as previously the counterexample object. So practically they don't learn anything from the negative experience. And we replicated this in a different group, same infants, practically finding the same results in a non-communicative demonstration. They learn from the negative experience. In the communicative, they don't learn from the negative experience, which would suggest to them that they interpreted the original demonstration as a statement about these kinds of objects generally, which actually allow them to just dismiss the negative evidence as broken objects, but it would not reduce their confidence that other objects should have the same property as well. We have an additional measure here, which which is interesting, although the result is not very strong, but I will still show you. So after the experiment, we actually give all three objects to the infant to see which one they reach for first, right? Which one they want to play with. In a non-conjugative context, they go back to the only one that worked, which is not surprising. This is what they should do because they have evidence that the other two did not work. But in the communicative context, they more or less choose among them equally, suggesting that they still think that what they learned is not about a single object from which the property could be extended to other objects, but they straight away learn something about this object kind. And so this kind of disregarding counter-evidence is not restricted to these studies. Let me show you another study where we found the same. This was actually an original unexpected finding. So the study goes like this. We show them this event. So what you learned from this, that this pink object is a banana peeler. And then we show infants this. So this blue object is a banana healer. And we show these two events many times until they learn it, and we can show that they learn this mapping. Which one is the healer, which one is the peeler. But in the crucial study, after they learn this, we show them a single event, which shows them counter-evidence. We show them one of the objects performing the opposite function, right? So in this case, the original peeler, no, it's a healer. So what should a rational learner infer from this? They should infer that our initial mapping was wrong. Probably both of these objects actually is just banana changers or something like that. So they can both heal and peel. So the original mapping was just a coincidence that they only just show them in certain kinds of functions, but not in the other functions. And then we test whether they still maintain the initial mapping between the functions and the objects. And then so again, the original demonstration of these object functions were done in a communicative or non-communicative way. Here it is done by the way that we either accompanied by the demonstration by adult-directed speech, which is not for the infant, or with infant-directed speech, which would say that it's a demonstration for them. So if there was adult-directed speech, then after this counter-evidence, they completely lost the mapping, so they did not care which objects did what, right? But if it was communicatively demonstrated to them what the object did originally, that they still maintained the original mapping and they still surprised when an object performed an opposite function, which suggests that they practically just disregarded the counter evidence or ignored that kind of effect. So in this case, infants fail to update their communication-induced knowledge when experienced counter evidence. And this is again not specific to these two kinds of studies. Liz Bonovitz showed in a very nice study many years ago that when children are taught something by communication, they are less likely to revise this knowledge or explore alternatives. And this is contrasted with situations when they learn something in a non-communicative way, just by observation. So this is what she called the double-edged sword of pedagogy. Because it can facilitate fast learning of generic knowledge, by which you can bypass laborious piecemeal sampling and inductive generalization. But it also makes such knowledge resistant to counter-evidence. So communication is a powerful way of maintaining accumulated cultural knowledge across generations, but it may also elicit some kind of confirmation bias, that is accepting only evidence that confirms the belief learned by this. And so in the final 2 minutes, I'd like to show you how we try to generalize what's going on here in a more wider context, and say something about the medium of how this nonverbal generics works. So most of these studies that I showed you that which are relevant here are demonstrations, are communicative demonstrations of properties and actions to infants and young children. So in these communicative demonstrations, you arrange objects in space and time in front of your audience in order to reveal properties of objects, relations among objects, or some rules that applies to objects. And so these are the dynamic arrangements that functions as the predicate of the message that you want to convey in an iconic format. In turn, the objects in the demonstration serve as the arguments of the predicate, right? But the predicates that you express by the arrangements of the objects applies not to the objects that's in front of you, right? But to any token of the specific object kinds. So for example, when someone shows you how to cut up a chicken, right, then what is shown to you is not how to cut up this chicken with this knife, but what is shown to you how to cut up a chicken with a knife, right? And this is what the demonstration conveys, and this is what you understand from it. So in that sense, these are symbolic acts in which those objects which are in the scene, they stand for an object of a certain kind. In most of these cases, they're objects of the very same kind that they belong to. So these demonstrations, in some sense, symbolic depictions. And the symbolic depictions is actually a much broader kind of things, which I would argue it constitutes a representational system, a medium which you can convey certain kinds of messages. It is open-ended, compositional, an external representational system which has this clear predicate argument structure. And I would also argue that these are ubiquitous in human societies and adopted for expressing various kinds of information, not just this kind of know-how of instrumental actions that I showed them before. Here are some examples. Puppet theaters do the same. Assembly instructions do the same. Many substitution pretense actions do the same. Diagrams of various kinds do the same. In this case, it's a family tree, and of course, animations do the same as well. This is a famous Heider and Zimmer animation from the early 40s, which are really very interesting because they show that you don't need conventions in order to interpret at least some kind of symbolic depictions like this. And also, I would suggest that human infants seem to be prepared to receive and interpret information in this kind of format. Those of you who were here on Tuesday, I showed you many studies in which this is what we do them. What we show infants symbolic depictions of these kinds in which visual objects are arranged in space and time in order to express something, and apparently they understand that. So in sum, I argued here that human infants can recognize when they are addressed by adults, and it's from birth. They can identify local reference of communication from about 6 to 8 months of age. They can interpret symbolic depictions presented to them from at least 12 months of age, probably earlier. Oh, sorry. And then they can extract generic knowledge from demonstrations from at least 18 months of age. And so these capacities together allow infants to learn from benevolent adults who share their knowledge with them via non-verbal, and of course also verbal communication. Thank you.